After decades building an empire, the loneliest place Julius Cole stood was at the top. Every smile felt bought, every "I love you" came with a price. At 56, the billionaire had one test for his glamorous fiancée before their wedding. He would pretend a tragic accident left him paralyzed and watch her true colors emerge. He didn't expect how quickly her charm turned to cruelty when she thought no one was watching. But someone was watching. Elena, quiet maid caring for him, saw past his wealth. She treated him with presence, not pity. As his fiancée revealed her gold-digging heart, Julius found himself falling for someone who loved him without knowing his worth. What happens when truth emerges? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Julius Cole stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching the city spread beneath him like a board game he had already won. The morning sun cast long shadows across his mahogany desk, where a crystal paperweight held down the latest quarterly reports, numbers that would make most men dizzy with their scope. Coal Industries had grown from a single construction contract 30 years ago into an empire spanning real estate, technology, and renewable energy. The corporate portrait hanging behind his desk showed a man in his prime, confident, decisive, wearing a suit that cost more than most people's cars. Yet the reflection in the window showed something else entirely, a weariness that no amount of success could cure. At 56, Julius had everything a man was supposed to want. The penthouse apartment occupied the entire top floor of Manhattan's most exclusive building, with views that stretched to the horizon in every direction. His garage housed a collection of vintage cars he rarely drove, while his wine cellar contained bottles worth more than some houses. The staff who maintained his various properties moved through his life like well-orchestrated dancers, anticipating his needs before he voiced them. His personal chef prepared meals that rivaled the finest restaurants. His driver navigated the city's chaos with practiced ease, and his housekeeper ensured every surface gleamed. Among the household staff was Elena Martinez, a woman in her early 30s whose presence had become as familiar as morning coffee. She possessed an uncommon grace in her movements, never rushing yet somehow accomplishing twice as much as the other staff members. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a simple bun, and she wore the standard grey uniform that marked her station. Yet there was something about her bearing that suggested depths beyond her role. Elena had worked for Julius for 3 years, initially hired as part of a temporary cleaning service, but kept on when the previous housekeeper retired. She spoke little but observed much, moving through the apartment with quiet efficiency while maintaining an invisible boundary of respect. What struck Julius most about Elena was her complete indifference to his wealth. While other staff members seemed perpetually aware of their employer's status, treating him with the calculated deference that money commanded, Elena simply did her work. She neither fawned nor cowered, asked for nothing beyond her agreed-upon wages, and treated his priceless artwork and rare books with the same careful attention she gave to dusting a simple lamp. In a world where everyone wanted something from him, her lack of agenda felt almost revolutionary. This morning, as most mornings for the past 8 months, Julius's thoughts turned to Victoria Ashworth. At 38, she possessed the kind of beauty that stopped traffic and the social connections that opened doors throughout New York's elite circles. Their engagement had been announced in the society pages with fanfare that suggested a merger more than a romance, complete with speculation about combining their considerable fortunes. Victoria moved through charity galas and exclusive events with practiced elegance, her arm linked through his as photographers captured their seemingly perfect union. Yet lately, Julius found himself studying Victoria the way he once analyzed potential business acquisitions, searching for flaws, testing assumptions, questioning the foundation beneath the polished surface. During their courtship, she had been attentive and charming, quick with laughter and seemingly genuine in her affection. But as their wedding date approached, subtle changes had begun to emerge. Her patience with his work schedule had grown thin, her requests for expensive gifts more frequent, her interest in his actual thoughts and feelings notably absent from their conversations. Last week, at the Morrison Foundation Gala, Julius had watched her from across the room as she mingled with other wealthy socialites. When she thought herself unobserved, Victoria's animated smile had faded into something calculating as she surveyed the crowd, clearly assessing social hierarchies and potential advantages. The transformation lasted only moments before she noticed his gaze and resumed her radiant persona. But those few seconds had lodged in his memory like a splinter. The doubt had been growing slowly, fed by small inconsistencies and subtle revelations. Victoria rarely asked about his work beyond its financial implications. She showed little interest in his background, his journey from a working-class neighborhood in Detroit to the pinnacle of American business success. Her family's old money pedigree seemed to regard his self-made fortune with barely concealed condescension, as if entrepreneurial wealth carried less legitimacy than inherited privilege. Most telling of all, she had never once visited him when he was genuinely unwell, always finding pressing social obligations that prevented her from playing nurse. Julius had built his fortune by understanding human nature, by reading people's true motivations beneath their presented facades. In business negotiations, this skill had served him well. He could spot desperation masquerading as confidence, identify hidden agendas behind earnest presentations, and recognize when someone was trying to sell him something he didn't need. Yet somehow, in matters of the heart, he had allowed himself to hope that Victoria might be different, that her feelings might be genuine rather than strategic. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who could see through the most complex corporate machinations had perhaps been blind to a much simpler deception. Or perhaps, he reflected with growing clarity, he had seen the signs all along but chosen to ignore them, preferring the comfort of companionship to the harsh reality of solitude. At his age and station, eligible women either wanted his money or were intimidated by his power, genuine. Connections seemed as rare as the diamonds Victoria favored. For her jewelry, this morning's revelation had crystallized his doubts into certainty. Victoria had called to cancel their planned lunch, citing a sudden appointment with her personal trainer. Yet Julius's driver had mentioned seeing her car at the Regency Hotel, where she was known to meet with Marcus Fitzgerald, a society photographer whose charm was exceeded only by his debts. The knowledge sat heavy in Julius's chest, not heartbreak exactly, but the weary disappointment of having his suspicions confirmed. Standing at his office window, Julius made a decision that surprised even him. He would not confront Victoria directly, would not engage in the messy drama of accusations and denials. Instead, he would create a test, a situation that would reveal her true character beyond any possibility of pretense or manipulation. The plan that formed in his mind was both elegant and cruel. A businessman's approach to affairs of the heart. He would stage an accident, something serious enough to render him helpless but not permanently damaged. A fall down the stairs, perhaps, resulting in temporary paralysis, frightening enough to test Victoria's loyalty when he could offer her nothing but burden. He would watch her react when she thought he might never walk again, when his vigorous presence was reduced to a wheelchair and dependence. Would she stand by him through genuine adversity, or would her true nature emerge when the glamorous lifestyle she enjoyed was threatened? The test would reveal everything. If Victoria truly loved him, she would rise to the challenge with grace and devotion. If she was merely a sophisticated gold digger, the mask would slip when faced with a future as caregiver to an invalid. Either way, Julius would have his answer before legally binding himself to a woman whose motivations remained unclear. As he contemplated his plan, Julius found himself thinking of Elena again. She would undoubtedly be assigned to help care for him during his supposed recovery, her calm competence making her the natural choice for such responsibility. He wondered how she would react to seeing her employer reduced to vulnerability, whether her professional demeanor would shift to pity, or if she would maintain her characteristic dignity. Something about the prospect of Elena's care felt less disturbing than Victoria's potential ministrations, perhaps because he suspected Elena's compassion would be genuine rather than performed. The corporate portrait stared down at him from the wall. That confident businessman who had conquered every challenge through determination and strategic thinking. Soon, that same strategic mind would be applied to the most personal test of his life. Julius Cole was about to discover whether money could truly buy love, or if he had been living a carefully constructed illusion that was about to shatter. The plan required precision, and Julius Cole had built his fortune on attention to detail. He spent 3 days orchestrating what would appear to be a tragic accident, calling in favors from contacts who owed him discretion along with their success. Dr. Sarah Chen, chief neurologist at Presbyterian Hospital and longtime recipient of Cole Industries' charitable donations, agreed to provide the necessary medical documentation. After Julius explained his need for privacy regarding a sensitive personal matter, the fabricated medical records would show spinal compression from a fall, temporary paralysis with uncertain prognosis, serious enough to test Victoria's devotion without crossing into permanent deception. On Thursday morning, Julius dismissed most of his household staff early, citing a desire for privacy. Only Elena remained, quietly organizing his study while he positioned himself at the top of the marble staircase leading to the penthouse's lower level. The elaborate staging felt almost theatrical, cushions strategically placed to break his fall, the timing calculated to ensure Elena would discover him first. As he prepared to tumble down the stairs with controlled precision, Julius felt a moment of profound sadness at the necessity of such an elaborate test. A man shouldn't need to fake paralysis to discover if his fiancée truly loved him. The fall itself was surprisingly painful despite his preparations. Julius allowed his body to go limp, rolling down the curved staircase with enough genuine impact to sell the deception. When he finally came to rest on the marble floor, groaning with authentic discomfort, he heard Elena's sharp intake of breath from the study doorway. "Mr. Cole!" Elena's voice carried genuine alarm as she rushed to his side, her professional composure intact despite the shock. She knelt beside him without hesitation, her hands gentle but certain as she checked for obvious injuries. "Don't move. I'm calling for help." Julius managed to whisper that he couldn't feel his legs, watching Elena's face tighten with concern as she dialed emergency services. Her Spanish accent became more pronounced under stress, but her instructions to the dispatcher were clear and precise. While they waited for the ambulance, she covered him with a throw blanket from the sofa, her touch careful and reassuring. There was no panic in her movements, no dramatic exclamations, just calm competence in the face of crisis. "You're going to be fine," Elena murmured, positioning a cushion under his head. "The paramedics will be here soon. Try to stay still." What struck Julius most forcefully was her complete presence in the moment. Elena wasn't thinking about how this would affect her schedule or worrying about her job security. She was simply there, offering what comfort she could to someone who appeared to be suffering. The contrast with what he anticipated from Victoria was already stark in his mind. The paramedics arrived with professional efficiency, carefully stabilizing Julius before transferring him to a stretcher. Elena followed the ambulance in her small Honda, staying in the hospital waiting room throughout the afternoon, while doctors conducted their elaborate charade of tests and consultations. Dr. Chen played her role perfectly, delivering the devastating diagnosis with appropriate gravity, while the fabricated medical records built a compelling case for spinal trauma. Victoria arrived at the hospital in a whirlwind of expensive perfume and designer clothing, her face a masterpiece of shocked concern. She rushed to Julius's bedside in the private room, tears glistening in her perfectly made-up eyes as she clutched his hand. "Oh my God, darling, what happened?" "They said you fell down the stairs." How could this happen to us?" Her voice trembled with what appeared to be genuine emotion, and for a moment Julius felt a flicker of doubt about his suspicions. Perhaps he had misjudged her after all. "The doctors say it's temporary," Julius said quietly, watching Victoria's face carefully. "Spinal compression. I can't feel anything below my waist right now, but there's hope for recovery with time and therapy." Victoria's relief was palpable, though Julius noticed her first question concerned his prognosis rather than his current pain. She stayed by his bedside for several hours, holding his hand and speaking softly about their future together, about how they would face this challenge as a team. Her performance was flawless, concerned, devoted, appropriately distressed but maintaining hope. Julius found himself almost convinced by her apparent sincerity. When the hospital discharged him 2 days later with a wheelchair and detailed care instructions, Victoria insisted on personally overseeing his transition back home. She had researched physical therapy options and spoken with specialists about spinal injuries, demonstrating a thoroughness that impressed even Julius. The penthouse was quickly modified with ramps and accessibility features, Victoria personally supervising the contractors to ensure everything met the highest standards. "I've arranged for round-the-clock nursing care," Victoria announced on his first morning home, consulting a leather-bound notebook where she had documented every aspect of his care plan. "The agency is sending their most qualified people." "That won't be necessary," Julius replied, watching her face carefully. "Elena has agreed to help with my daily needs. I'm more comfortable with someone I know." The flash of irritation that crossed Victoria's features lasted barely a second, but Julius caught it. She quickly rearranged her expression into one of loving concern, but the brief glimpse behind her mask was revealing. "Darling, I hardly think a housekeeper is qualified for medical care. You need professionals who understand spinal injuries." Victoria's voice carried a note of condescension when she mentioned Elena's role. Though she maintained her caring tone, "Elena has experience caring for her elderly grandmother," Julius lied smoothly. "And Dr. Chen says my needs are primarily assistance with daily activities, not complex medical intervention." Victoria's smile grew tight around the edges. "Of course, if that's what you prefer. Though I do worry about the quality of care you'll receive." Over the following days, Julius observed a fascinating dynamic emerge between the two women who now shared responsibility for his well-being. Elena approached her expanded duties with characteristic competence, learning to operate the wheelchair lift and helping Julius navigate his altered routine without fuss or patronizing commentary. She treated his condition as a temporary inconvenience to be managed, rather than a tragedy to be mourned. Her matter-of-fact approach both dignified and comforting. Victoria, meanwhile, seemed to struggle with the reality of caregiving despite her initial enthusiasm. She arrived each morning impeccably dressed and perfectly coiffed, as if preparing for a photo shoot rather than spending time with an invalid. Her attempts to help with basic tasks like transferring from wheelchair to bed were clumsy and half-hearted, often requiring Elena to step in and complete what Victoria had started. More telling were the moments when Victoria thought herself unobserved. Julius caught her checking her phone constantly, her fingers drumming impatiently on surfaces when conversations focused on his therapy progress rather than social events. She frequently excused herself to take calls from friends, her laughter filtering back into the room with a lightness that contrasted sharply with her subdued demeanor during their private moments. The first real crack in her facade appeared during his 3rd week home, when Julius experienced what appeared to be a setback, muscle spasms, that left him crying out in apparent agony. Elena immediately knelt beside his wheelchair, her hands gentle but firm as she helped him through the episode, speaking softly in both English and Spanish, while her touch provided genuine comfort. Victoria, standing by the window when the spasms began, had frozen in place. She made no move to assist, her face reflecting not compassion but something closer to revulsion. Only when Elena glanced in her direction did Victoria rush forward, her concern so obviously performed that Julius almost felt embarrassed for her. "Should I call Dr. Chen?" Victoria asked, keeping her distance even as she voiced appropriate concern. "It's passing," Julius managed, leaning into Elena's steady presence as the manufactured pain began to subside. "Elena knows what to do." The look Victoria shot at Elena in that moment contained enough venom to power the city, though she quickly masked it when she realized Julius might be watching. The test was already revealing more than Julius had expected, and they were only 3 weeks into what he had planned as a months-long evaluation. The physical therapy equipment arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by uniformed men who assembled the sophisticated machinery in what had once been Julius's private gym. The parallel bars gleamed under the recessed lighting, while resistance bands and specialized exercise mats promised hope for recovery that Julius knew would never come, at least not from the fabricated injury he was pretending to endure. Victoria had insisted on purchasing the most expensive equipment available, consulting with 3 different specialists to ensure they had everything necessary for spinal rehabilitation. "The therapist will be here this afternoon," Victoria announced, reviewing her meticulously organized schedule as Julius sat in his wheelchair beside the unused equipment. "Dr. Rodriguez comes highly recommended for cases like yours. She's worked with professional athletes." Julius nodded appropriately, though the irony of hiring a physical therapist to treat an imaginary condition struck him as almost absurd. The equipment would serve its purpose as a prop in his elaborate deception, gathering dust while he pretended to struggle with exercises designed to restore function he had never lost. Each piece represented not just false hope, but the growing complexity of maintaining his charade. Elena entered the room carrying a tray with Julius's morning coffee, her movements careful around the new equipment. She had adapted to his supposed condition with remarkable grace, learning to anticipate his needs without making him feel helpless. Unlike Victoria, who often spoke to him in the overly bright tone people reserved for children or invalids, Elena maintained her natural speaking voice and treated him with the same respectful distance she had always observed. The therapist called to confirm the appointment. Elena said quietly, setting the coffee within easy reach of his wheelchair. She asked about your current mobility level and pain management needs. The casual way Elena delivered this information highlighted another growing complication in Julius's plan. She had become an unwitting accomplice to his deception, required to support his fabricated limitations without understanding their artificial nature. Watching her conscientiously prepare for medical appointments to treat his non-existent paralysis generated an unexpected guilt that Julius hadn't anticipated when designing his test. Dr. Rodriguez arrived precisely on time. A no-nonsense woman in her 40s who assessed Julius's condition with professional thoroughness. Victoria hovered nearby during the initial evaluation, asking detailed questions about treatment protocols and recovery timelines. Her engagement seemed genuine, though Julius noticed how she positioned herself where the afternoon light from the windows cast her most flatteringly. "We'll start with basic range of motion exercises," Dr. Rodriguez explained, manipulating Julius's legs in ways that required him to consciously suppress his natural reflexes. "The goal is maintaining muscle tone and preventing complications while we wait for neural pathways to regenerate." Julius found himself genuinely impressed by the therapist's expertise, even as he performed the role of someone whose body wouldn't obey his commands. The irony of receiving excellent medical care for a condition that existed only in fabricated records wasn't lost on him, though he committed fully to the performance for Victoria's benefit. After the session, Victoria excused herself to attend a charity committee meeting, kissing Julius's forehead with practiced tenderness before departing in a cloud of expensive perfume. Her relief at leaving was subtle but unmistakable. The slight quickening of her step, the immediate brightening of her expression once she thought herself unobserved. Elena remained behind to help Julius navigate the transition back to his regular wheelchair, her hands steady as she assisted with the transfer. During these moments of physical assistance, Julius became acutely aware of her presence in ways that surprised him. There was something profoundly intimate about depending on another person for basic mobility, even when that dependence was manufactured. Elena's touch was clinical yet gentle, efficient without being cold. Miss Victoria asks many questions about your therapy. Elena observed quietly as she positioned his wheelchair by the window, overlooking Central Park. She wants to understand everything. Julius detected something in Elena's tone that suggested careful neutrality, as if she were choosing her words deliberately. "And what do you think about my progress?" Elena paused in her straightening of the therapy equipment, considering her response with characteristic thoughtfulness. "I think recovery takes time. Sometimes people expect too much too quickly." The comment could have been about his medical condition, but Julius suspected Elena was referring to Victoria's visible impatience with the slow pace of rehabilitation. In recent days, Victoria had begun making subtle comments about how long spinal injuries typically required for healing. Her research apparently extending to recovery timelines as well as treatment options. That evening, as Elena prepared his dinner, Julius found himself studying her with new attention. She moved through the kitchen with quiet efficiency, her presence somehow soothing in ways he was only beginning to understand. Unlike Victoria's dramatic beauty that demanded attention, Elena possessed a gentler attractiveness that revealed itself gradually. The graceful line of her neck as she worked, the concentration that softened her features, the unconscious elegance in her simplest gestures. "Elena," Julius said impulsively, "tell me about your family." She looked up from plating his meal, surprise flickering across her features. In 3 years of employment, Julius had rarely asked personal questions, maintaining the professional distance appropriate between employer and staff. "My grandmother lives in Queens," Elena replied carefully. "I have 2 younger brothers finishing college. My parents returned to Puerto Rico when my father retired, and you chose to stay in New York. Someone needs to care for Abuela," Elena explained, her voice carrying affection for her grandmother. "And the work here is steady. Good employers are not always easy to find." Julius felt a stab of something, gratitude perhaps, or recognition of loyalty that existed without financial motivation. Elena could undoubtedly find better-paying positions elsewhere, yet she had remained in his employ without complaint or requests for advancement. Her dedication seemed rooted in simple reliability rather than ambition or calculation. Later that evening, after Elena had left for the day and Victoria had returned from her committee meeting, Julius observed his fiancée's behavior with growing clarity. She recounted the charity event with animated enthusiasm, her energy returning now that her social obligations were fulfilled. But when the conversation turned to his therapy session and Dr. Rodriguez's assessment, her interest visibly waned. Recovery could take months, Julius mentioned, watching Victoria's reaction carefully. "Of course." "Darling," Victoria replied, though her smile seemed forced, "we'll face whatever comes together." Yet Julius noticed how quickly she changed the subject to wedding plans that would need postponing, her voice carrying a note of frustration beneath her supportive words. The elaborate ceremony they had planned for spring would have to be delayed indefinitely, a fact that clearly troubled her more than his supposed medical condition. Victoria prepared to leave for her own apartment. She had maintained separate residences throughout their engagement. Julius pretended to doze in his wheelchair. Through half-closed eyes, he watched her gather her belongings with barely concealed eagerness to escape the oppressive atmosphere of caring for an invalid. The physical therapy equipment stood silent in the gathering darkness. Expensive machinery that would serve no real purpose beyond maintaining his deception. Each gleaming piece represented not just false hope, but the growing complexity of a test that was revealing more about everyone involved than Julius had originally intended. The wheelchair cushion arrived without fanfare, a specialized piece of medical equipment designed to prevent pressure sores in long-term patients. Elena had researched and ordered it after noticing Julius shifting uncomfortably during their extended therapy sessions. Her attention to such details, both touching and troubling to a man who didn't actually need the accommodation. The cushion represented the growing depth of her care. Thoughtful, practical, and completely genuine in its concern for his comfort. Victoria, meanwhile, had spent the morning selecting fabric samples for the postponed wedding reception, spreading swatches of silk and satin across Julius's dining table, as if his condition were merely a temporary inconvenience to be worked around, rather than a life-altering challenge. Her planning continued with undiminished enthusiasm, though she now spoke of "when you're better" with the casual certainty of someone discussing a minor cold. "I've decided on the champagne silk for the tablecloths," Victoria announced, holding up a shimmering fabric sample. "It will complement the roses beautifully, and the photographer says it creates wonderful ambient lighting for portraits." Julius nodded from his wheelchair, noting how naturally Victoria's conversation focused on aesthetic details, rather than practical considerations like wheelchair accessibility or mobility accommodations. The wedding she envisioned remained a fantasy of perfection that didn't account for the reality of his supposed condition. "Have you considered that some of our guests might have difficulty with the venue's steps?" Julius asked mildly, testing her awareness of accessibility issues. Victoria's brief pause suggested the thought hadn't occurred to her. "Oh, I'm sure they can install a temporary ramp if needed," she replied dismissively, returning her attention to the fabric samples. These details worked themselves out. Elena entered the room carrying Julius's lunch, automatically navigating around Victoria's wedding materials with practiced efficiency. She had positioned his wheelchair cushion on the seat that morning, adjusting it carefully to provide proper support without drawing attention to the modification. Such thoughtfulness had become characteristic of her care, small gestures that anticipated his needs rather than waiting for requests. "Dr. Rodriguez called to reschedule Thursday's appointment," Elena informed him quietly. "She suggested adding hydrotherapy to your treatment plan. There's a facility in Manhattan that specializes in spinal rehabilitation." Victoria looked up from her fabric samples with sudden interest. "Hydrotherapy? That sounds promising. How quickly might we see improvement?" The eagerness in her voice was unmistakable, as if recovery were a schedule to be negotiated rather than a medical uncertainty. Julius watched Elena's expression remain carefully neutral, though he sensed she had also noticed Victoria's focus on timelines rather than his comfort or progress. "Recovery varies for each patient," Elena replied diplomatically. "The important thing is consistent treatment and patience." "Of course," Victoria agreed quickly, though her smile seemed strained. "I just want to understand what we're working toward." After lunch, Victoria excused herself for a shopping appointment with friends, leaving Julius alone with Elena as she cleaned up the wedding materials. He found himself studying Elena's movements as she carefully folded the expensive fabric samples, her touch respectful despite her obvious discomfort with their extravagant cost. "You don't approve of the wedding planning," Julius observed. Surprising himself with his directness, Elena paused in her tidying, clearly weighing her response carefully. In their 3 years of working relationship, she had never offered unsolicited opinions about his personal life, maintaining professional boundaries that Julius was now intentionally crossing. "It's not my place to approve or disapprove," Elena said finally. "But perhaps wedding plans can wait until you're feeling stronger." Her diplomatic phrasing couldn't quite conceal her real meaning, that planning an elaborate celebration while he struggled with basic mobility seemed oddly prioritized. Julius appreciated her restraint in not stating the obvious more bluntly. "Victoria is trying to maintain normalcy," Julius offered, though even as he spoke the words, he recognized their hollowness. Elena simply nodded, but something in her expression suggested she understood the difference between maintaining normalcy and ignoring reality. She finished organizing the wedding materials without further comment, though Julius sensed volumes in her silence. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor, Marcus Fitzgerald, The society photographer Julius's driver had spotted with Victoria weeks earlier. Marcus arrived under the pretense of discussing engagement photos for a magazine feature. His charm as polished as his expensive camera equipment. "Julius, my friend," Marcus greeted him with the overfamiliar warmth of someone trying too hard. "Victoria mentioned you might be interested in a photo shoot once you're feeling better. Something inspirational about overcoming challenges." The irony wasn't lost on Julius. Posing for inspirational photographs about overcoming a condition he was faking seemed like a new depth of deception. Yet Marcus's presence raised more immediate questions about his relationship with Victoria and how much the photographer knew about Julius's situation. "That's thoughtful," Julius replied carefully. "Though I'm not sure I'm ready for public exposure of my condition." Marcus nodded with practiced sympathy, though his eyes assessed Julius's wheelchair and altered circumstances with professional calculation. Of course. When you're ready." "Victoria speaks so beautifully about your courage through this difficult time." The comment struck Julius as oddly phrased, suggesting conversations between Marcus and Victoria that went beyond professional photography discussions. Throughout the brief visit, Marcus displayed an unexpected familiarity with details of Julius's condition and treatment, knowledge that could only have come from intimate discussions with someone close to the situation. After Marcus departed, Julius found himself troubled by the encounter. Victoria's relationship with the photographer clearly extended beyond their business arrangements, and her sharing of personal medical information suggested a level of intimacy that crossed appropriate boundaries. The possibility that his supposed paralysis had become gossip fodder in Victoria's social circle added another layer of complications to his deception. Elena returned from running errands to find Julius unusually quiet, his wheelchair positioned by the windows as evening shadows lengthened across the apartment. She moved through her closing duties with characteristic efficiency, but paused before leaving for the day. "Mr. Cole," she said hesitantly, using the formal address she maintained despite their growing familiarity. "If you need anything tonight, anything at all, you have my number." The offer was simple but profound in its sincerity. Unlike Victoria's dramatic declarations of devotion, Elena's quiet assurance carried the weight of genuine commitment. She would answer his call, not because duty demanded it or because she hoped to gain something, but because caring for others seemed as natural to her as breathing. "Thank you, Elena," Julius replied, meaning it more than she could possibly know. "I appreciate everything you've done." She nodded once and gathered her belongings, leaving Julius alone with his thoughts and the specialized wheelchair cushion that represented more genuine concern than all of Victoria's expensive wedding plans combined. The contrast between the two women's approaches to his condition was becoming impossible to ignore, even as the complexity of his deception continued to grow. The handwritten recipe card emerged from Elena's purse by accident, fluttering to the floor as she retrieved her keys one evening. Julius watched from his wheelchair as she quickly bent to retrieve it, but not before he glimpsed the faded ink and careful Spanish script that covered the yellowed paper. The card represented something precious, a tangible link to family traditions and personal history that spoke to depths beyond her professional role in his life. "Your grandmother's recipe?" Julius asked gently, having noticed Elena's protective way of handling the delicate paper. Elena hesitated, clearly debating whether to share something so personal. "Arroz con gandules. She taught me when I was 8 years old, made me write down every step so I wouldn't forget." Her voice carried affection, tinged with sadness. "I cook it for her every Sunday when I visit." The simple revelation opened an unexpected window into Elena's world, a life of family obligations and traditions that existed entirely separate from her employment. Julius found himself curious about this other Elena, the woman who spent Sundays cooking traditional dishes for an elderly grandmother, who maintained connections to heritage and history through handwritten recipes and weekly visits. "Would you teach me sometime?" The request surprised them both, as such personal exchanges had never been part of their professional relationship. Elena's expression showed gentle amusement. "I think cooking from a wheelchair might be challenging." "Mr. Cole." "Perhaps," Julius conceded, though he found himself genuinely interested in learning something that mattered to Elena beyond their employer-employee dynamic. "When I'm recovered, then." The moment passed as Victoria arrived for their scheduled dinner, her entrance accompanied by the rustle of shopping bags and the breathless energy of someone who had spent the day acquiring expensive things. She kissed Julius's cheek with automatic affection while describing her afternoon purchases: jewelry for the postponed wedding, custom shoes that would complement her reception dress, accessories that assumed a future celebration neither her fiancé's current condition nor timeline could guarantee. "Darling, I've been thinking about our honeymoon," Victoria said, settling into the chair across from Julius while Elena quietly began preparing their dinner. "Perhaps we should consider destinations with better medical facilities. Switzerland has excellent rehabilitation centers, and the mountain air might be therapeutic." Julius noted how Victoria's honeymoon revision still centered on exotic locations and luxury accommodations, merely adding medical convenience as an afterthought. Her planning continued to exist in a realm of wishful thinking that didn't truly account for the reality of long-term disability. "That's thoughtful," Julius replied, though he wondered if Victoria had researched accessibility at Swiss resorts, or simply assumed that money could overcome any practical obstacles. During dinner, Victoria maintained animated conversation about friends' activities and social events, her stories painting a picture of a life that continued unchanged despite her fiancé's condition. She spoke of charity galas she planned to attend alone, shopping excursions with girlfriends, and weekend trips that no longer included Julius. Her adaptation to his altered circumstances seemed to involve creating a separate social existence rather than modifying shared activities. "Rebecca's engagement party is next weekend," Victoria mentioned casually. "I know you can't attend, but I thought I should represent us both." The easy assumption that Julius would naturally be excluded from social gatherings struck him as particularly revealing. Victoria had quickly accepted his absence from their shared social circle, adapting to his limitations by resuming her previous single lifestyle, rather than seeking ways to include him despite his condition. Elena served their meal with characteristic quiet efficiency, but Julius noticed her subtle reactions to Victoria's monologue. A slight tightening around her eyes when Victoria described expensive purchases, a carefully neutral expression when honeymoon plans were discussed. Small signs that suggested Elena heard the same disconnect between Victoria's words and her fiancé's reality. After dinner, Victoria excused herself to take a phone call, leaving Julius alone with Elena as she cleared the table. In the silence that followed Victoria's departure, Julius found himself unusually aware of Elena's presence. The soft sound of dishes being collected, the subtle scent of her simple soap, the careful way she moved around his wheelchair. "Elena," Julius said impulsively, "what do you think of Victoria?" The question violated every boundary of professional propriety, and Elena's pause suggested she understood its inappropriate nature. Julius waited, genuinely curious whether she would offer an honest opinion or retreat behind diplomatic neutrality. "Miss Victoria is very beautiful," Elena said finally, her voice carefully measured. "And she loves beautiful things." The response was masterfully diplomatic, neither critical nor endorsing, yet somehow conveying volumes about Elena's true assessment. Julius found himself smiling at her elegant evasion, appreciating both her discretion and her subtle message. "And what about you, Elena? What do you love?" She looked up from her clearing, surprise flickering across her features at such a personal question. For a moment, Julius thought she might deflect as she had before, maintaining the professional distance that had defined their relationship. "Simple things," Elena replied softly. "Sunday dinner with my grandmother. A book that makes me think. Gardens where children play. Things that don't cost money but have value." Her answer revealed a philosophy so different from Victoria's that Julius felt as if he were glimpsing an entirely foreign approach to life. Elena found satisfaction in relationships and experiences rather than acquisitions, in giving rather than receiving. The contrast with his fiancée's material focus was striking and somehow liberating. Victoria returned from her phone call with renewed energy, announcing plans for a weekend spa retreat with friends. "You'll be fine with Elena, won't you, darling?" "I really need the relaxation after all this stress," Julius agreed, though he noted how Victoria framed her need for escape as recovery from stress, rather than acknowledging that caring for him might be emotionally demanding. Her absence would actually come as relief, a chance to drop the constant performance his condition required in her presence. As the evening concluded, and Victoria prepared to leave for her own apartment, Julius observed the ritual of their goodbyes with new clarity. Victoria's kiss was perfunctory, her promises to call the next day delivered with distracted cheerfulness. She gathered her belongings with barely concealed eagerness, clearly ready to resume her independent evening plans. Elena remained to help Julius prepare for bed, her assistance professional, but somehow more intimate than Victoria's dramatic displays of devotion. There was something profound about depending on someone who offered help without fanfare or expectation of gratitude, who treated his vulnerability with dignity rather than pity. After Elena left for the night, Julius sat alone in his bedroom, the handwritten recipe card's image lingering in his mind. That yellowed paper represented traditions passed down through generations, family bonds maintained through simple acts of sharing and caring. It stood in stark contrast to Victoria's wedding fabric samples, beautiful but superficial, focused on appearance rather than meaning. The test he had designed was revealing truths about all three of them, though not necessarily the ones he had expected to discover. The insurance claim forms lay spread across Julius's desk like evidence of a crime, which in many ways they were. Victoria had insisted on filing for disability benefits and medical coverage related to his accident. Her efficiency in navigating the bureaucratic requirements both impressive and deeply troubling. The documents represented not just fraud, but Victoria's assumption that his condition would be permanent enough to justify long-term financial planning. Around his disability, the insurance company approved the maximum benefit amount. Victoria announced triumphantly, reviewing the paperwork with obvious satisfaction. "That's nearly $8,000 monthly, plus full medical coverage for rehabilitation services." Julius stared at the forms bearing his forged signature, feeling the weight of his deception expanding beyond a simple test of loyalty. Victoria's enthusiastic pursuit of insurance benefits suggested she had already accepted his paralysis as permanent, building financial structures around his supposed disability rather than hoping for recovery. "Don't you think it's premature to file these claims?" Julius asked carefully. Dr. Rodriguez said recovery was still possible. Victoria's smile flickered slightly. "Darling, we need to be practical. Even if you do recover, which of course I pray you will, it could take years. Why shouldn't we receive the benefits you've paid for through your premiums?" Her pragmatic approach to profiting from his fictional condition felt like another betrayal, though Julius recognized the bitter irony of being upset by Victoria's fraud when he was perpetrating a much larger deception. Still, her eagerness to monetize his paralysis suggested a calculating mind that viewed his disability as an asset rather than a tragedy. Elena entered the room carrying his afternoon coffee, her eyes briefly taking in the insurance documents before she set down the tray. Unlike Victoria, who handled the forms with proprietary satisfaction, Elena seemed uncomfortable with their presence, as if she understood something improper was taking place. Dr. Rodriguez called to confirm tomorrow's hydrotherapy appointment, Elena informed him quietly. "She wants to discuss expanding your treatment program. More treatments mean more insurance coverage," Victoria added brightly. "The policy covers experimental therapies if they're recommended by specialists." Julius watched Elena's face carefully, noting her almost imperceptible flinch at Victoria's comment about maximizing insurance benefits. In Elena's world of honest work and simple values, Victoria's opportunistic approach to his medical condition must have seemed distasteful, though she would never voice such opinions directly. That afternoon, while Victoria attended another charity committee meeting, Julius found himself alone with Elena in the apartment's library. She was organizing his books, a task that seemed to bring her quiet pleasure as she handled the volumes with careful respect. Julius watched her work, noticing how she paused to read certain titles, her expression showing genuine interest in subjects ranging from history to philosophy. "You're welcome to borrow any of those books," Julius offered, breaking their comfortable silence. Elena looked up in surprise, clearly uncertain whether such familiarity was appropriate between employer and employee. "Thank you, Mr. Cole, but I wouldn't want to damage them. They're meant to be read, not just displayed," Julius insisted gently. "What subjects interest you?" She hesitated before answering, as if revealing personal interests might cross professional boundaries. "History, especially about immigration and family stories. My grandmother tells me about coming to New York in the 1960s, but I'd like to understand more about what she experienced, her curiosity about family history and broader social contexts revealed an intellectual depth that Victoria's conversations about shopping and social events completely lacked. Julius found himself genuinely interested in Elena's thoughts, in the books that captured her attention and the questions that occupied her mind during quiet moments. "There's a wonderful book on Puerto Rican immigration in the third shelf," Julius suggested. The author interviewed hundreds of families about their experiences. Elena's face lit with genuine enthusiasm, a transformation that made Julius realize how rarely he had seen her personal interests engaged. She moved to the suggested shelf with obvious excitement, carefully withdrawing the volume he had mentioned. "You've read this?" she asked, examining the book's cover. "Years ago," Julius replied. "I found the family stories particularly moving, how people carried their traditions to new places while adapting to unfamiliar circumstances. Their conversation about immigration, tradition, and family adaptation continued for nearly an hour, ranging from Elena's grandmother's experiences to broader patterns of American cultural change. Julius discovered that Elena possessed not just compassion and work ethic, but a keen intelligence that had never been called upon in her role as his housekeeper. Her observations were thoughtful and nuanced, her questions revealing curiosity about complex social issues. Victoria's return interrupted their discussion, her entrance marked by the rustle of new shopping bags and the announcement of social plans that excluded Julius as a matter of course. She barely glanced at Elena, who quietly excused herself to resume her duties, taking the immigration book with obvious reluctance, as if uncertain whether Julius's offer had been genuine. What was Elena doing in here so long? Victoria asked with casual curiosity that carried an undertone of suspicion. "We were discussing books," Julius replied truthfully. "She's interested in immigration history." Victoria's laugh was light, but somehow dismissive. How ambitious of her, though I suppose everyone needs hobbies." The comment revealed Victoria's fundamental inability to see Elena as anything more than household staff, someone whose intellectual interests were quaint at best and inappropriate at worst. Julius felt a flash of irritation at Victoria's casual condescension, though he kept his reaction carefully controlled. That evening, as Victoria detailed her plans for the weekend spa retreat, Julius found his attention drifting to thoughts of Elena reading the immigration book, imagining her grandmother's stories taking on new context through historical perspective. The contrast between Elena's curiosity about meaningful subjects and Victoria's focus on luxury and entertainment had become impossible to ignore. "I've also made appointments with the wedding planner for next month," Victoria continued, spreading new catalogues across the coffee table. "Even if we have to postpone the ceremony, we can finalize all the details for when you're better." Julius noted the automatic assumption that he would recover sufficiently to participate in Victoria's elaborate wedding plans. despite her simultaneous filing of insurance claims that assumed permanent disability. The contradiction suggested that Victoria's relationship with his condition remained fundamentally superficial, serious enough to generate insurance benefits, but temporary enough to not interfere with her long-term social ambitions. After Victoria departed for another evening with friends, Julius sat alone with the insurance form she had left behind, each document representing another layer of deception built upon his original lie. The test he had designed to reveal Victoria's true character was succeeding beyond his expectations. Though the evidence was proving more damaging than he had anticipated, the forms would need to be withdrawn, the claims reversed, the fraud undone before it progressed further. Yet doing so would require explanations that would expose his own deception, creating complications that extended far beyond his relationship with Victoria. His simple test had evolved into a web of lies that was becoming increasingly difficult to unravel without consequences that would touch everyone involved. The morning newspaper lay folded on Julius's breakfast tray, its business section containing a photograph that would shatter the careful deception he had maintained for 6 weeks. Elena had placed it there routinely, as she did every day, unaware that today's edition contained an image from the previous evening's charity gala, a photograph of Victoria dancing intimately with Marcus Fitzgerald while Julius supposedly recuperated at home. The image captured more than inappropriate behavior. It revealed a relationship that had clearly progressed far beyond professional photography services. Julius stared at the photograph, recognizing the ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria, where Victoria had claimed to be attending a brief appearance for charity obligations. The image showed her in Marcus's arms, her expression one of obvious infatuation as they moved together on the dance floor. Other couples surrounded them, but Victoria's body language suggested she was completely focused on her partner, lost in a moment of intimacy that made Julius's absence from the event seem almost convenient. Elena returned from the kitchen carrying fresh coffee, moving with her characteristic quiet efficiency until she noticed Julius's stillness over the newspaper. She paused, concern flickering across her features as she recognized his tension. "Mr. Cole, is everything all right?" Julius looked up to find Elena studying him with genuine worry, and something in her expression, the authenticity of her concern compared to Victoria's performed devotion, suddenly made his elaborate deception feel unbearable. 6 weeks of lies, of watching Elena care for a condition that didn't exist, of accepting her genuine compassion under false pretenses, crashed down on him with unexpected weight. "Elena," he said quietly, his voice carrying a gravity that made her immediately attentive. "I need to tell you something important, something I should have told you weeks ago." She moved closer, her professional instincts alert to what seemed like a medical emergency. "Should I call Dr. Rodriguez?" "No," Julius replied, then made a decision that surprised even him. "Elena, I can walk." The words hung in the air between them, their meaning so contrary to everything she had witnessed that Elena simply stared at him, clearly trying to process what he had said. "I don't understand," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Julius looked down at his hands, shame washing over him as he realized the magnitude of what he had put her through. "The accident was staged. The paralysis is fake. I've been lying to everyone, including you, for 6 weeks. Elena's face went through a series of expressions, confusion, disbelief, and then something approaching comprehension as pieces of a puzzle began fitting together. She took a step backward, her hand reaching for the back of a chair as if she needed support. "You can walk," she repeated, her voice hollow with shock. "Yes," Julius confirmed, then slowly stood from his wheelchair, his legs working perfectly as they had throughout the entire deception. The simple act of rising felt both liberating and devastating, especially as he watched Elena's face register the full implications of his confession. Elena stared at him, standing there, her expression cycling through emotions too complex for easy interpretation. "Why, she asked finally, the single word carrying the weight of betrayal, confusion, and hurt. Julius gestured to the newspaper photograph still lying on the breakfast tray. I wanted to test Victoria's loyalty before our wedding. I suspected she was more interested in my money than in me, and I needed to know the truth. Elena's eyes moved to the photograph, taking in the image of Victoria and Marcus together. Her face hardened as understanding dawned, not just about Julius's deception, but about her unwitting role in exposing Victoria's infidelity. So I was part of your test, Elena said, her voice gaining strength as anger began to replace shock. You made me complicit in your lie. I cared for you, worried about you, researched treatments for your condition, all while you were perfectly fine. The pain in her voice cut through Julius more sharply than any business negotiation failure ever had. He had anticipated Victoria's anger when the truth eventually emerged, but he hadn't fully considered how his deception would affect Elena, who had given genuine care based on fabricated need. Elena, I'm sorry, Julius began, but she held up a hand to stop him. I defended you to people who whispered about your fiancé's behavior, Elena continued, her composure cracking. I told my grandmother about the noble man I cared for who was struggling with his condition. I worried about you every night when I went home, wondering if you were comfortable, if you needed anything. Each revelation of her genuine concern felt like another weight added to Julius's growing burden of guilt. He had been so focused on testing Victoria that he had completely overlooked the impact of his deception on someone who had shown him authentic compassion. I researched spinal injuries to better understand your needs, Elena went on, her voice gaining intensity. I learned about pressure sores and bought you that special cushion. I practiced transfers so I wouldn't hurt you when helping you move. All for a lie. Julius watched tears begin to form in Elena's eyes, and he realized that his revelation wasn't just about exposing his deception. It was about destroying the trust of the one person who had treated him with genuine care throughout his manufactured crisis. The worst part, Elena said, her voice breaking slightly, is that I began to care about you, not as an employer, but as a person who was struggling and needed help. I thought I saw something real in you during these weeks, something honest and vulnerable that wasn't there before your accident. Her words hit Julius with unexpected force because they revealed a truth he hadn't wanted to acknowledge. During his deception, he had indeed shown Elena aspects of himself that he normally kept hidden. His vulnerability, even if artificially created, had allowed for a connection that his usual confident persona never permitted. What you saw was real, Julius said quietly. The vulnerability, the connection between us, that wasn't part of the deception. Elena shook her head, tears now flowing freely. How can I believe anything you say? You've been lying to me every day for 6 weeks. Every conversation we had about your recovery, every moment I comforted you during painful therapy, every time I worried about your future, it was all based on lies. Julius felt the full weight of what he had done, not just to test Victoria, but to someone who had shown him the kind of authentic care he had been searching for his entire adult life. He had found genuine affection and received it under completely false pretenses. You're right to be angry, Julius said, his voice heavy with regret. I never considered how my test would affect you. I was so focused on discovering Victoria's true nature that I ignored my responsibility to someone who was showing me real kindness. Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, struggling to regain her composure. And Victoria? Does she know? No, Julius admitted. She still believes I'm paralyzed. Elena stared at him for a long moment, clearly processing the full scope of his deception and its ongoing implications. So you're going to continue lying to her while telling me the truth? What makes you think I won't expose your deception? The question hung between them, and Julius realized he had no answer that didn't sound completely self-serving. He had revealed the truth to Elena, not because it was the right thing to do, but because his guilt had become unbearable in the face of her genuine concern. Now he was essentially asking her to become his accomplice in continuing the deception with Victoria. I don't have the right to ask that of you, Julius said finally. You've already done more than anyone could reasonably expect based on a complete lie. Whatever you decide to do with this information, I'll understand. Elena looked at him, standing there, no longer the vulnerable man she had been caring for, but a wealthy businessman who had orchestrated an elaborate deception. The transformation was jarring, and Julius could see her trying to reconcile the person she thought she knew with the reality of who he actually was. I need time to think, Elena said finally, her voice exhausted. I need to process what this means. For you, for Miss Victoria, for me. She gathered her belongings with mechanical precision, her movements lacking the grace and warmth that had characterized her care over the past 6 weeks. At the door, she paused without turning around. The man I thought I was caring for, the one who discussed books and asked about my family, was any of that real? That was the most real I've been in years, Julius replied honestly. Elena nodded once, then left without another word, leaving Julius alone with his newspaper, his wheelchair, and the devastating realization that his test had revealed not just Victoria's true character, but the authentic connection he had never expected to find with someone who had loved him without agenda or expectation. The resignation letter arrived by courier that afternoon. Elena's handwriting precise and formal on Cole Industries' letterhead she must have taken from his office supplies. The document represented more than just the end of her employment. It was a judgment of his character, written in carefully chosen words that maintained professional courtesy while making her disappointment unmistakably clear. Julius read it 3 times, each pass revealing new layers of hurt beneath Elena's diplomatic phrasing. I regret that circumstances require my immediate resignation from your household staff, the letter began, its formality a stark contrast to the personal conversations they had shared over recent weeks. I have arranged for a replacement through the agency to ensure continuity of care during your recovery. Even in her resignation, Elena was protecting his deception, maintaining the fiction of his paralysis, while extracting herself from the lie she could no longer support. Julius sat in his wheelchair, a prop that now felt like a prison, contemplating the destruction his test had wrought. Victoria's infidelity, captured in that morning's newspaper photograph, seemed almost trivial compared to losing Elena's respect and trust. The woman he had hired to test his fiancée's loyalty had instead revealed his own capacity for thoughtless cruelty, showing him a reflection of himself that was far more damaging than Victoria's gold-digging nature. The afternoon brought Dr. Rodriguez for his regularly scheduled therapy session, and Julius found himself going through the motions of his fake exercises with mechanical precision. The physical therapist's genuine concern for his progress now felt like another betrayal. A professional, dedicating her expertise to treat a condition that existed only in fabricated medical records. Your range of motion seems improved today, Dr. Rodriguez noted with cautious optimism. Sometimes breakthrough moments come unexpectedly in spinal recovery cases. Julius managed appropriate responses about hoping for continued improvement, all while knowing that his recovery was a performance designed to gradually phase out the therapy sessions. The entire medical charade felt increasingly grotesque, especially with Elena's resignation letter folded in his pocket like evidence of his moral bankruptcy. Victoria arrived that evening in unusually high spirits, her cheerfulness jarring against Julius's somber mood. She moved through the apartment with energetic purpose, seemingly unaware that her infidelity had been exposed in the morning newspaper. Her obliviousness to the photograph's implications suggested either remarkable confidence in her deception or complete lack of concern about being discovered. "Darling, I have wonderful news," Victoria announced, settling into the chair beside his wheelchair with theatrical flourish. "Marcus, you remember Marcus Fitzgerald, the photographer? He's arranged for a magazine feature about couples overcoming adversity. They want to showcase our story, how we've grown stronger through your accident." The irony was breathtaking. Victoria wanted to monetize their relationship's supposed triumph over adversity, while simultaneously conducting an affair with the very photographer who would document their fictional resilience. Julius stared at her, marveling at her ability to compartmentalize duplicity with such casual efficiency. "A magazine feature seems premature," Julius replied carefully. "My condition is still uncertain." "That's exactly what makes it compelling," Victoria insisted, her excitement undimmed. "The uncertainty, the hope, the way love conquers all obstacles. Marcus thinks it could be syndicated internationally." Julius noted how naturally Victoria referred to Marcus by his first name, her familiarity with the photographer's career ambitions, revealing the intimacy of their relationship. The magazine feature represented not just public exploitation of his fabricated condition, but a joint venture between his fiancée and her lover, with Julius as the unwitting subject of their professional and personal collaboration. "I prefer to keep our private matters private," Julius said, watching Victoria's reaction to his resistance. Her smile faltered slightly, revealing a flash of irritation before she rearranged her features into sympathetic understanding. "Of course, darling. I just thought it might inspire other couples facing similar challenges. But we can certainly wait until you're feeling more comfortable with public attention." That evening, after Victoria departed for another social engagement, Julius found himself alone in the apartment for the first time since Elena's discovery of his deception. The silence felt different now, charged with the weight of truths revealed and consequences pending. He moved through the rooms without his wheelchair, his legs working perfectly as they had throughout the entire charade. Yet he felt more disabled now than during any moment of his fake paralysis. The immigration book Elena had borrowed still sat on the library table where she had left it, a bookmark protruding from its pages, marking her progress through the family stories that had captured her interest. Julius opened to her marked page, finding a chapter about women who had crossed borders to build new lives while maintaining connections to their cultural heritage. The parallel to Elena's own story, caring for her grandmother while adapting to American life, was obvious and somehow deeply moving. He imagined Elena reading these accounts, recognizing her own family's experiences in the documented struggles and triumphs of previous generations. The thought that their book discussions had represented genuine intellectual connection rather than employer-employee courtesy made her departure feel like a more significant loss than he had initially realized. In Elena, he had found not just authentic care, but meeting of minds. Someone whose curiosity and compassion complemented his own search for meaning beyond material success. The phone rang near midnight, startling Julius from his brooding contemplation. He expected Victoria's voice, perhaps calling from whatever social event was keeping her out late, but instead heard Elena's familiar accent. "Carefully controlled but clearly strained. Mr. Cole, I'm sorry to call so late, but I need to speak with you about something important." "Of course," Julius replied, his heart rate accelerating with hope that she might be reconsidering her resignation. "I've been thinking about everything you told me today," Elena continued, "and I realize there are consequences beyond just our personal situation. The insurance claims, the medical treatments, Dr. Rodriguez's time. Your deception affects more people than just Miss Victoria and me." Julius felt a chill of recognition at her words. In his focus on the interpersonal drama of his test, he had indeed overlooked the broader implications of his fraud. Insurance companies were paying claims for non-existent injuries. Medical professionals were dedicating resources to treating imaginary conditions, and systems designed to help genuinely disabled individuals were being exploited for his personal investigation. "You're right," Julius admitted. "I hadn't fully considered the wider impact." "I won't expose your deception to Miss Victoria," Elena said, her voice carrying quiet strength. "That's between you and her. But the insurance fraud and medical deception, that needs to stop. People who really need those resources are being denied them because of your lies. Her moral clarity was both humbling and inspiring. Elena had found a way to respond to his betrayal that transcended personal hurt, focusing instead on the broader ethical implications of his actions. She was willing to protect his personal relationship with Victoria, while demanding accountability for his abuse of medical and insurance systems. "I understand," Julius replied. "I'll begin reversing the insurance claims tomorrow and gradually phase out the medical treatments. How will you explain your recovery?" Julius had been grappling with this question since his confession to Elena. Ending his deception required careful orchestration to avoid exposing the fraud to authorities while allowing for believable improvement in his condition. "Gradual improvement over several weeks," he said. "Unexpected but not medically impossible. Dr. Rodriguez will be pleased to have contributed to such a positive outcome." Elena was quiet for a moment, and Julius could hear her breathing as she considered his plan. "What about Miss Victoria? Will you tell her the truth?" The question struck at the heart of Julius's dilemma. Victoria's infidelity, captured in that morning's photograph, had already answered his original question about her loyalty and motivations. Yet revealing his deception would expose his own dishonesty and manipulation, making him hardly better than the woman he had been testing. "I don't know," Julius answered honestly. "The test proved what I suspected about her character, but it also revealed things about my own character that I don't particularly like. Testing people's loyalty by deceiving them seems like a contradiction," Elena observed gently, her words carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. Julius absorbed her insight, recognizing the fundamental flaw in his approach. He had sought to discover honesty through dishonesty, to find authentic love through manufactured crisis. The test had indeed revealed character, but perhaps not in the ways he had intended. "Elena," he said impulsively, "I know I have no right to ask this after what I've put you through, but would you consider staying, not as household staff, but as—" He paused, unsure how to define what he was offering. "As someone who helps me figure out how to be a better person." The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities and the weight of choices that would define their future relationship. Julius waited, his heart racing, as he realized that Elena's answer would determine not just his household arrangements, but his capacity for genuine human connection after years of suspicion and isolation. "I need more time to think," Elena said finally, "about everything. About what kind of person you really are, and what kind of person I want to be." After she hung up, Julius remained sitting in the darkened library, Elena's immigration book still open in his lap. The stories of courage and reinvention seemed to speak directly to his situation, the possibility of becoming someone different, someone worthy of the authentic love he had glimpsed in Elena's care. Tomorrow would bring decisions about Victoria, about the insurance fraud, about the fundamental direction of his life. But tonight, he simply sat with the weight of his choices and the hope that redemption might still be possible. The engagement ring sat in its velvet box on Julius's desk, the 3-carat diamond catching morning light as he stared at the symbol of promises neither he nor Victoria had kept. He had retrieved it from the safe that morning, the weight of the platinum band somehow heavier than he remembered when he had placed it on Victoria's finger 8 months ago. The ring would be returned today, along with the truth about his deception and the end of a relationship built on mutual deception and misplaced priorities. Julius had spent the night preparing for this conversation, rehearsing words that would expose his fraud while confronting Victoria's infidelity. The newspaper photograph of her dancing with Marcus lay beside the ring box, evidence of her betrayal that had ultimately freed him to acknowledge his own. 2 deceptions would be revealed today, 2 relationships would end, and the elaborate charade that had consumed 6 weeks of their lives would finally conclude. Victoria arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, her punctuality unchanged, despite her obvious eagerness to conclude their morning routine and move on to more entertaining activities. She entered the library where Julius waited, her smile bright with the false warmth that had characterized their interactions throughout his supposed disability. "Good morning, darling," Victoria said, bending to kiss his cheek with practiced affection. "You look better today. More color in your face." Julius noted the casual observation about his improved appearance, another small indication that Victoria's attention to his condition was superficial at best. During 6 weeks of supposed paralysis, she had rarely noticed subtle changes in his demeanor or physical state. Her focus consistently directed elsewhere. "Victoria, we need to talk," Julius said, his voice carrying a gravity that immediately shifted the atmosphere in the room. She settled into the chair across from him, her expression shifting to concern with theatrical precision. "Of course, darling. Is it about your therapy? Dr. Rodriguez mentioned you're showing remarkable improvement." "It's about this," Julius said, sliding the newspaper photograph across the desk toward her. Victoria's face went through a rapid series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and then carefully controlled calm as she processed the image of herself dancing intimately with Marcus Fitzgerald. Her recovery was impressive, Julius had to admit, as she quickly rearranged her features into innocent surprise. "Oh my goodness, where did this come from?" Victoria asked, picking up the photograph with delicate fingers. "This makes it look so much more intimate than it actually was. Marcus and I were simply dancing at the charity gala. You know how photographers can make innocent moments appear scandalous." Julius watched her performance with something approaching admiration for its technical skill. Victoria had transformed from court adulteress to innocent victim of photographic misrepresentation in mere seconds, her voice carrying just the right note of wounded bewilderment. "Victoria," Julius said quietly, "I know about your relationship with Marcus. This photograph is evidence, not misrepresentation." Her mask slipped for just a moment, revealing a flash of calculation before she resumed her injured innocence. "Relationship? Julius, I think your condition is affecting your judgment. Marcus is a professional colleague, nothing more." "A professional colleague you've been meeting at hotels," Julius continued, watching her face carefully. "A professional colleague you discuss my private medical information with. A professional colleague you dance with like a lover while your paralyzed fiancé recovers at home." Victoria's composure finally cracked, anger replacing her practiced confusion. "How dare you have me followed? What kind of man spies on his fiancée instead of trusting her during the most difficult time of their relationship?" The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to be uncomfortable. Julius had indeed been testing and observing Victoria, though not in the way she imagined. Her counterattack was skillful, turning the conversation from her infidelity to his supposed paranoia. The kind of man who suspected his fiancée was more interested in his money than his recovery, Julius replied. The kind of man who wanted to know if the woman he planned to marry would stand by him during genuine adversity. "And I have stood by you," Victoria declared, her voice rising with righteous indignation. "I've rearranged my entire life around your condition. I postponed our wedding, cancelled social obligations, spent every day caring for your needs." Julius felt the moment arriving when he would have to reveal his own deception, the admission that would transform him from wronged fiancé to calculating manipulator. The engagement ring sat between them, like a witness to the elaborate lies they had both constructed. "Victoria," he said, standing slowly from his wheelchair, "I need to tell you something about my condition." She stared at him in shock as he rose to his full height, her mind clearly struggling to process what she was seeing. "You're standing," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've always been able to stand," Julius replied, watching her face cycle through disbelief, understanding, and finally fury. The paralysis was fake. The accident was staged. "For 6 weeks, I've been testing your loyalty while pretending to be disabled." Victoria's mouth opened and closed without sound, her composure completely shattered by the revelation. When she finally found her voice, it carried a rage that made her earlier anger seem mild by comparison. "You bastard," she breathed, rising from her chair with trembling hands. "You made me care for an invalid who wasn't actually injured. You put me through 6 weeks of worry and adjustment and sacrifice for a lie. The same 6 weeks you spent conducting an affair with Marcus Fitzgerald, Julius pointed out, though he felt no satisfaction in the response. Don't you dare try to justify this, Victoria snarled, her elegant facade completely abandoned. Whatever I did with Marcus doesn't excuse your sick, twisted test. You manipulated me, lied to medical professionals, committed insurance fraud, all to satisfy your paranoid suspicions about my motives. Julius recognized the truth in her accusations, even as he understood that her outrage was largely about being caught rather than genuine hurt over his deception. Victoria's anger focused on his methods rather than examining her own behavior during his supposed disability. You're right, Julius said simply. My test was manipulative and cruel, but it did reveal something important. We're both capable of elaborate deceptions when it serves our purposes. Victoria stared at him for a long moment, her chest heaving with suppressed fury. Then she noticed the engagement ring sitting in its box on his desk, understanding immediately what its presence meant. So this is it? She asked, her voice now cold rather than heated. You're ending our engagement because I failed your sick test. Julius picked up the ring box, holding it out toward her. I'm ending our engagement because we both know this relationship was never based on love. You wanted my money and status. I wanted a beautiful woman who would enhance my image. Neither of us was being honest about our real motivations. Victoria took the ring box with hands that had steadied, her business-like composure returning as she processed the end of their relationship in practical rather than emotional terms. What about the insurance claims? The medical treatments? She asked, her mind already moving to the complications his revelation would create. I'll handle those, Julius replied. You don't need to worry about any legal consequences from my deception. Victoria nodded once, then gathered her purse with mechanical precision. At the library door, she paused without turning around. For what it's worth, Julius, you're right about my motivations. But at least I never pretended to be paralyzed to test someone's character. Your deception is far worse than mine. With that final judgment, she left, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she walked out of his life forever. Julius remained standing in the library, the engagement ring gone, his elaborate test finally concluded, and the truth, ugly and complicated, finally revealed to everyone involved. The wheelchair sat empty in the center of Julius's living room, a symbol of deception that had served its purpose and would never be needed again. He had called the medical supply company that morning to arrange its return, along with the hospital bed, accessibility ramps, and specialized equipment that had transformed his penthouse into a care facility for an invalid who had never existed. Each piece represented not just the end of his elaborate charade, but the beginning of a reckoning with the man he had revealed himself to be. The afternoon brought a parade of phone calls as Julius began the complex process of unwinding his deception. Dr. Rodriguez expressed professional delight at his miraculous recovery, though her medical training made her curious about the sudden improvement in his condition. Julius crafted explanations about gradual sensation returning, breakthrough moments during therapy, and the unpredictable nature of spinal trauma recovery. The lies came easily after 6 weeks of practice, though they sat heavy in his conscience. Sometimes the body surprises us, Dr. Rodriguez said with genuine warmth during their final phone consultation. Your case will certainly be one I remember, a testament to the power of persistence and proper treatment. Her sincere pleasure in his supposed recovery made Julius feel like a fraud in ways that extended far beyond his medical deception. This woman had dedicated her expertise to his care, celebrating what she believed was a triumph of human resilience over physical adversity. The knowledge that her professional success story was built on lies added another layer to his growing burden of guilt. The insurance company proved more complicated, requiring detailed medical documentation to support the sudden improvement in his condition. Julius spent hours coordinating with Dr. Chen to provide convincing evidence of his recovery, creating a paper trail that would justify the cessation of disability benefits without raising suspicions about fraud. The process reminded him of complex business negotiations, except the stakes involved his freedom rather than profit margins. Elena called during the late afternoon, her voice carefully neutral as she inquired about his progress in ending the deception. "I've returned the medical equipment and begun the insurance documentation," Julius reported, finding comfort in her practical concern even as her emotional distance remained palpable. "Dr. Rodriguez is convinced my recovery is genuine, though remarkable. And Miss Victoria?" Elena asked, her question carrying undertones Julius couldn't quite decipher. "I told her everything," Julius replied. "About the fake paralysis, about knowing of her affair with Marcus, about ending our engagement. She's gone." Elena absorbed this information in silence, and Julius imagined her processing the implications of Victoria's departure. The household would need reorganization, schedules would change, and the dynamic that had defined the past 6 weeks would be completely altered. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," Elena continued, "about needing help to become a better person. I don't think that's something one person can do for another." Julius felt his heart sink at her words, recognizing what sounded like a gentle but final rejection of his request for her to stay. Yet Elena's voice carried thoughtfulness rather than dismissal, suggesting her response might be more complex than simple refusal. "But I think people can help each other grow," she added, "if they're both honest about who they really are and what they want from each other." The qualification offered a slim thread of hope, though Julius remained uncertain about Elena's ultimate decision regarding their future relationship. Her emphasis on honesty struck directly at the heart of his recent behavior, challenging him to consider whether he was capable of the transparency she required. "I want to be honest with you, Elena," Julius said, "about everything. About why I created this test, about what I learned from watching you care for me, about feelings I didn't expect to develop." "Those are conversations that need to happen in person," Elena replied. "Not over the phone, and not while you're still processing the end of your engagement." Her wisdom impressed Julius, even as it frustrated his urgency to repair their relationship. Elena understood that meaningful conversations about their future required time and space, not rushed declarations in the aftermath of dramatic revelations. "Will you at least consider returning to work?" Julius asked. "Not as household staff, but as someone who helps me figure out what comes next." "I need to visit my grandmother this weekend," Elena said, neither accepting nor declining his offer. "She's been asking about the man I've been caring for, wanting to know if he's improving." I'd like to tell her something true for once. After Elena ended the call, Julius found himself alone in an apartment that felt different without the medical equipment and the constant presence of his fictional disability. The spaces seemed larger somehow, less constrained by the artificial limitations he had imposed on himself. Yet the physical freedom felt hollow without the emotional connections he had damaged through his deception. That evening, Julius stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city lights that had once represented his conquest of the business world. The view remained the same, but his perspective had fundamentally shifted. Wealth and power felt less significant now than the authentic human connections he had glimpsed and potentially lost through his elaborate test. The empty wheelchair in his peripheral vision served as a constant reminder of the choice he faced. He could return to his previous life of suspicion and isolation, protecting himself from potential deception by maintaining emotional distance from everyone around him. Or he could risk vulnerability in pursuit of the genuine connections that Elena had shown him were possible, even for someone who had built an empire on strategic thinking and careful control. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as he continued dismantling the infrastructure of his deception while trying to rebuild relationships damaged by his lies. The process would require the kind of courage he had never needed in business negotiations, the courage to be genuinely vulnerable without hidden agendas or strategic calculations. The wheelchair would be gone by morning, but the choices it represented would remain, defining the kind of man Julius Cole would become in the aftermath of his elaborate and costly test. The handwritten note arrived 3 weeks later, delivered not by courier, but personally placed in Julius's mailbox by Elena during her morning walk through the neighborhood. Her simple stationery bore no letterhead or formal formatting, just careful script that conveyed more intimacy than any business communication ever could. The note represented a bridge between their complicated past and an uncertain future, written in Elena's own hand rather than typed on official paper. Julius opened it slowly, recognizing the significance of this personal touch after weeks of silence between them. Elena's words were characteristically thoughtful, each sentence carefully chosen to convey meaning without unnecessary elaboration. "I told my grandmother about you," the note began. "Not about the test or the deception, but about a man who was learning to see beyond his wealth, to discover what really matters. She said something I think you should hear. Mijo, everyone makes mistakes. The question is whether they learn to make better choices." Julius found himself smiling at the grandmother's wisdom, imagining Elena sitting in a queen's apartment, sharing stories about her former employer with a woman whose life experience had taught her to recognize genuine character beneath surface appearances. The inclusion of her grandmother's perspective felt like an invitation into Elena's world, a glimpse of the family relationships that grounded her in values he had only recently begun to understand. The note continued, "I've spent these weeks thinking about forgiveness, not just forgiving you for your deception, but understanding why someone would feel the need to test love rather than simply accepting it when offered. I think I understand now that you were protecting yourself from disappointment, though your method caused pain to everyone involved." Her insight pierced through Julius's carefully constructed justifications for his behavior, revealing the fundamental fear that had motivated his elaborate charade. He had indeed been protecting himself from the pain of discovering that Victoria's love was conditional, though his method had ultimately caused far greater damage than the truth would have inflicted. "If you're still interested in having someone help you become a better person," Elena's note concluded, "perhaps we could start with honesty about what we both want from each other. I finish work at the bookstore on Saturday at 5 o'clock. There's a small cafe called Luna's on 82nd Street, where my grandmother and I sometimes have dinner. If you'd like to have a conversation about truth and second chances, I'll be there until 6. Julius read the note 3 times, each pass revealing new layers of meaning in Elena's carefully chosen words. She was offering him an opportunity for redemption, but on her terms and in her environment, rather than the luxurious settings that defined his world. The cafe she had chosen was undoubtedly modest, probably filled with working families and elderly immigrants, rather than business executives and society figures. It represented a test of his willingness to step outside his comfort zone in pursuit of authentic connection. Saturday afternoon found Julius standing outside Luna's cafe, a small establishment tucked between a grocery store and a laundromat in a Queens neighborhood he had never visited. The contrast with his usual haunts was stark. No valet parking, no maître d' to ensure the best table, no wine list curated by sommelier. Instead, he saw families sharing plates of rice and beans, elderly couples holding hands over coffee, children playing between tables while their grandparents watched with patient affection. Elena was seated at a corner table, reading a book he recognized from his library, the immigration history volume she had borrowed before his revelation destroyed their working relationship. She looked up as he approached, her expression guarded but not hostile, offering him a careful smile that acknowledged his presence without committing to warmth. "You came," she said simply, closing the book and gesturing to the chair across from her. "I wasn't sure you wanted me to," Julius admitted, settling into a seat that had seen better decades. "After everything I put you through, I wouldn't have blamed you for deciding I wasn't worth the effort." Elena studied his face with the careful attention she had always brought to important matters. My grandmother taught me that people reveal their true character not in their mistakes, but in how they respond to the consequences of those mistakes. The past 3 weeks showed me someone trying to repair damage rather than justify it. Julius nodded, understanding that his actions during the aftermath of his confession had been as important as the confession itself. His efforts to reverse the insurance fraud, properly compensate Dr. Rodriguez for her time, and honestly acknowledge his deceptions had apparently registered as genuine attempts at accountability rather than mere damage control. I've learned something about myself through this experience, Julius said, choosing his words carefully. I've spent so many years protecting myself from people who might want something from me that I never learned to recognize someone who simply wanted to know me. Elena's expression softened slightly, though she maintained the cautious distance of someone who had been hurt and was choosing carefully whether to risk further pain. And what do you want now? Not from me specifically, but from life. The question struck at the heart of Julius's transformation over the past weeks. His elaborate test had been designed to confirm his cynical assumptions about human nature, yet it had instead revealed possibilities he had never allowed himself to consider. I want to learn how to accept genuine care without suspicion, Julius replied. I want to give back in ways that matter rather than just writing checks for tax benefits. I want to know what it feels like to be loved for who I am rather than what I can provide. Elena nodded slowly, her careful evaluation of his words suggesting she was weighing sincerity against practiced charm. Those are beautiful goals, but they require vulnerability and patience, qualities that don't come easily to someone who's built their life around control and strategic thinking, which is why I need help, Julius admitted. Not someone to change me, but someone to remind me when I'm falling back into old patterns of suspicion and manipulation. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the cafe's other patrons navigate their own relationships and conversations. Julius found the atmosphere unexpectedly soothing, the gentle chaos of family life, the multilingual chatter that reflected the neighborhood's diversity, the sense of community that his isolated penthouse had never provided. My grandmother wants to meet you, Elena said finally, her words carrying significance that extended far beyond casual introduction. She says any man who can learn from his mistakes and ask for help is worth knowing. The invitation felt like a door, opening to possibilities Julius had never imagined. Integration into a family, structure built on mutual care rather than financial obligation, acceptance based on character rather than net worth. Love offered without calculation or agenda. I would be honored to meet her, Julius replied, meaning it with surprising depth. As they prepared to leave Luna's cafe, Elena handed him the immigration book she had been reading. I think you should finish this. Some of the family's stories remind me of your journey. People who had to lose everything they thought defined them before they could discover who they really were. Julius accepted the book, understanding it as both gift and assignment. The stories of transformation and adaptation would serve as a guide for his own journey from isolation to connection, from suspicion to trust, from protecting his wealth to investing in relationships. Walking Elena to the subway station, Julius reflected on how different this courtship felt from his relationship with Victoria. There were no expensive restaurants or luxury gifts, no dramatic gestures or calculated romance. Instead, there was honest conversation, mutual respect, and the slow building of trust between two people who had seen each other at their worst and chosen to believe in the possibility of better. As Elena descended into the subway, she turned back once to offer him a genuine smile, not the careful expression she had maintained throughout their cafe conversation, but the warm look he remembered from their book discussions in his library. The smile carried promise without commitment, hope without naivety, an acknowledgement that second chances were possible but not guaranteed. Julius returned to Manhattan carrying Elena's grandmother's book, and the knowledge that he had been offered something more valuable than any business deal he had ever negotiated. The path forward would require courage, patience, and the willingness to be vulnerable in ways his wealth had never demanded. Yet for the first time in decades, Julius Cole felt genuinely hopeful about the future, not because he could control it, but because he was finally learning to trust it.